It's painful to accept that the ruthless behaviour of the Howard government achieved its object, but I think it did. And I think it was actually wrong, but also politically dangerous for people on the left not to see that.
Robert Manne, in your article in the September issue of The Monthly, you write about asylum seekers in Australia. You argue that the Howard government policies did succeed, in fact, in stopping the boats, but that the left refused to accept this fact. Others have argued that external factors, rather, were the ones that reduced the number of boats to a trickle. Why are you so sure that it wasn't the external factors?
I think that the main thing is to look at the facts, and I followed the issue with great intensity. There were something like 12,000 people arrived before Tampa and the Pacific Solution in the 2 and a bit years prior. A few boats came during the sort of institution of the Pacific Solution and Operation Relax, and then really they just stopped coming. And until 2008, there were, I think, 300 people arrived by boat compared to 12,000 in 3 years. Now, it seems to me implausible to think that the slight changes in problems in the world could account for that vast decrease in the numbers. And so the obvious explanation is the things that were done by Australia. And the commonsensical position is that if people knew that they would come to Australia, either get to Christmas Island or be intercepted by the Navy, and then have to spend an unknown number of years in the hellhole of Nauru that Australia had created, why would they spend thousands of dollars? That seems to me to be the sensible position.
And what?
And I think the important point about this is that, and it's a sort of political point that seems to me very significant, people don't like to believe certain things if they hold certain values. And people on the left tend to want to think that ruthless methods don't work. I'm a realist in many ways, and I have always thought that in a certain kind of ruthlessness often does work. And I think it's painful to accept that the ruthless behaviour of the Howard government achieved its object, but I think it did. And I think it was actually wrong, but also politically dangerous for people on the left not to see that, because I think it caused problems for the future.
What position do you think the left could have adopted given your reading of this situation?
I think in retrospect it would have been more sensible to do something like Julia Gillard did, which is to talk about a regional processing centre, not on Nauru but somewhere else, which would be relatively, compared to Nauru, relatively humane, in which people wouldn't be in detention but they'd have to wait in a sort of orderly fashion for processing. That may have helped prevent a new arrival of boats. I didn't think that at the time. This is me being, it's retrospective. What I did think at the time was that if you get rid of the Pacific Solution, which the Rudd government did, then you are crazy to believe boats won't come back. And I did write that at the time in the Monthly, in fact. So I think putting their heads in the sand by the government, also by the asylum-seeker supporters, meant that problems were in store. And the Rudd government, should have, for example, thought, what are we going to do when the boats return? Because they seemed to think the boats wouldn't return against all common sense and logic.
It was a great political misjudgment with such a strong majority supporting the Howard position. Do you think the asylum-seeker issue is always destined to become a political football, given this? Well,
I think this is the tragedy. If Howard had not done what he did, I think it could have remained outside, real political struggle. If it's what I would call the elite consensus had stuck.
It was like the very strength of the divisions was what drove him further, what pushed that policy even further in some ways.
Yeah, well, he couldn't have known, I suppose, when he improvised the policy how well it would do for him. But it was an amazing achievement, in inverted commas, because it completely split Labor, amongst the core Labor supporters were appalled by Beazley's behaviour, but Beazley, on the other hand, I think rightly said, if I really opposed what Howard was doing, we would be absolutely destroyed in the election. So it split Labor. It was an immensely politically successful move, even though I think it was a dreadful act.
The central puzzle, as you argue, is to understand why Australians are overwhelmingly hostile to asylum seekers who reach our shores by boat. What do you think the main reasons are?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important that there are almost too many good reasons. It's not hard to explain it. What's hard to do is to work out which are the most important. And I just say what I think are some of the important ones. One is, I think it's probably the most popular explanation, is our history. The argument would go, if for 100 years you are fearful of an invasion by people from the Asia-Pacific region in an area of white settlement, and in particular you feel the borders are insecure, then when the borders, when boats do start arriving, the wash of history comes to matter a great deal. And so it seems to me the legacy of white Australia doesn't play itself out now in obvious hostility to non-white migration, but it does seem to play itself out in this issue to do with the fact that asylum seekers are seen to threaten kind of the control of migration. But I think a lot of things are going on in contemporary society, if I could mention one or two, that really matter. The genuinely ludicrous aspect of this whole debate has been the fact that people who feel population pressure have come to think asylum seekers and boat arrivals have to be seen to be responsible. Now, most people don't follow enough to know that for every asylum seeker who's deemed a refugee who arrives spontaneously, one fewer refugee is taken from the Offshore program, which means that really, truly, the effect on population of asylum seekers is zero, or at least it's zero unless there were more than 14,000 who arrived and were accepted as refugees in a year. In other words, it's utterly irrational that population pressures and the failure of infrastructure is linked to the boat people, but that's what has happened. And so, as I say in the article, people seething in a traffic jam in Western Sydney think and hear Tony Abbott say, "Stop the boats." Say, yes, this is, we're being overwhelmed by. And then there's just ordinary racism.
Gillard's first major policy speech was about the asylum seeker issue. It was at the Lowy Institute. Do you think she genuinely believed that she had a better option and a policy outcome that was workable, or was it simply a political act to put that to bed before the election?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, she said something which I must say sort of disturbed me, which was she said her parents, have never had any privileges and they've done it tough as migrants. And it may have been genuine. She may have picked up some of that feeling from her family, and now it comes out to the surface. In general, I think with someone like Julia Gillard, you can't distinguish between the politically necessary and the truly believed. I don't think many people are cynical in the sense that they know they don't believe something and do it, but they allow politics to gradually form their beliefs. The one thing we know for certain is that she decided for political reasons she had no alternative, and that everyone in the Labor machine was saying, including her Minister for Immigration, Chris Evans, must have been saying by that time that this issue will kill us in the election unless we take action. And one of the reasons that Rudd was overthrown was that he seems to have been saying to his advisors, no, I won't change. We're not going to have a race to the bottom over asylum seekers. But I think in the context, everyone, and I would include myself in this, everyone believed that the asylum seeker issue, once used ruthlessly by Abbott, was going to do incredible harm to Labor's chances of re-election.
And do you agree with the general consensus that the East Timor solution was poorly thought out?
Yes. I mean, you never know whether there has been pre-thought within the immigration department. They often do think about things, and maybe there was some thinking about it. We all know that only Ramesh Horta was even told about it. And we don't know yet, at the time we're talking today, as to how it would work. I mean, it from many points of view doesn't make any sense, and I'm sure Julia Gillard has no idea how it would actually work. So the evidence is that it was, improvised, and presumably it wasn't something that Rudd had even given consideration to, I would think, so it came pretty suddenly.
Do you think the prominence of the asylum-seeker issue in the recent election indicated something, told us something about the nature of the election itself or of the major parties?
I think it tells us a lot. A number of things. One is, it seems to me to tell us that we live in the age of what I call populist conservatism, that there is a kind of atmosphere which favours issues of this kind, which are easy to understand and which inflame popular sentiment, and which are easily manipulable by politicians or manipulated by politicians. It tells us something about the opposition. Under Malcolm Turnbull, the return of the Pacific solution would not, in my view, have occurred. There wouldn't have been this rhetoric of stop the boat. So it shows what the victory of Tony Abbott in the coalition meant. And it shows that on this kind of populist conservative issue, Labor is permanently in a difficult situation.
Looking forward, if offshore processing is found to be legal and consistent with our obligations to the UN Charter of Human Rights, and I believe there's a court case in the High Court at the moment, do you think offshore processing should be pursued by the Australian government?
Look, I think we've got to the situation where the issue has become so politicised that you either have offshore processing or you don't. You either have it more humane or less humane, but you either have it or you don't. If you don't have it, boats return. And if boats return, it seems to me at present that it will become again a political issue. There is a sort of very complex point to be made, that if you have a system which deters boats from arriving, you are harming international law by the process of offshore processing. But if boats don't arrive, you don't need to process anyone offshore, because you only process people who have arrived. So that in the years of the Howard government, not many people suffered as a result of offshore processing, except at the beginning. Towards the end, no one was arriving, so no one was being sent to Nauru. It just was closed down, and there was just no traffic. It seems to me that the left, those who care about asylum seekers, should place emphasis now on increasing the annual quota of refugees that the country takes, rather than sticking to the idea that you get rid of offshore processing and then you hope that Australian opinion will not again be able to be mobilised around the question of their irritation or anger with spontaneous arrivals. It's a nasty position to have to be in, that I find myself in, but it's one where honesty, self-honesty gets me to go. In other words, I do not oppose what Julia Gillard is trying to do, in the hope that will mean that people smugglers don't choose Australia as a destination for anyone, so that East Timor doesn't find people arriving. And rather, I think that if one's concerned with Australia being host to refugees, that one puts a lot of pressure on increasing the quota. And I have another idea which I've never floated or written about, but which I would like to see proposed, which is a sponsorship system. That is, there should be a quota of refugees each year, but if humanitarian people wish that quota to be increased, there should be a capacity to put in a certain amount of money in support to increase the quota. And that would actually, a lot of people on the right say it's easy to be a soft-hearted liberal or a bleeding heart. But, would you do anything personally to help? Well, that would be a way of testing it. If the doctors' wives care about, the doctors' wives in inverted commas care about refugees, then they could sponsor, not particular people, but sponsor an additional refugee. And that would in a way be an answer to the right-wing case, which says, it's easy for you to say that these people should be allowed to be settled here, but what are you doing for that?
It's interesting because there's a few mayors around the country in regional parts who are advocating a similar position, or saying that they'd be happy to have processing centres in their areas.
Yeah, but that's because economies in rural Australia and regional Australia are so poor that you generate income if you have an asylum seeker. So that's not necessarily humane. It's sort of tolerant, I suppose, but it's not humane because it's, I think, at least largely driven by the sense that this would inject income into regions which badly need income. But I mean people who get nothing in reward.
Is Australia unique amongst Western nations in the way that it approaches the asylum seeker issue?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, you know, in every country there's a different sort of asylum seeker policy and a level of hostility to asylum seekers. But I think the more general answer is that I think throughout the West, including Europe and the United States, recent politics is more and more coming to be dominated by the desire to close the country to unwanted others or outsiders, which it comes in different forms. I mean, probably the single most important or second most important issue in European politics after the financial crisis is the idea that Islamic settlers or migrants are causing troubles, and politics all over Europe is being affected by that issue. In the United States, the genuinely large issue of, they say 4 million illegal immigrants from Mexico and some elsewhere is becoming gradually a very big left-right issue. And in Australia, we have the asylum seeker issue, not 4 million, but a few thousand a year. But I think there is a common pattern, which is that in Western societies, the feeling in the age of globalisation is to draw up your bridges to prevent the sense of being overtaken by others. And I think that's a big psychological, political issue of contemporary globalised world. So I think our little story fits into a much larger cultural pattern.
I have a final question. This issue reflects a major divide in Australia, in the Australian electorate, between inner city latte sippers and outer suburban and regional Aussie battlers. Do you think politicians are ever likely to change the way they approach this issue, particularly with the new government in mind?
I mean, there's a hope actually that's come from the independence that our politics might become slightly less seedy than they've been and slightly more humanitarian than they've been. I think there is a hope with the new government that that's the case. But the issue's now been around consistently for 9 years, coming and toing and froing. So I see it as a sort of like a poison that's entered the body politic, and it's very hard for it to be neutralised. And what the antidote is very unclear to me. In other words, there's going to be contention over whatever new system is finally instituted for offshore processing, and I think the chances of there being no offshore processing are very remote. Although how it happens, no one can yet tell. But I do think for quite a long time the issue is going to be, the poison is going to be in the system. This, in my view, completely irrational hostility to the possibility of boat arrivals, and only perhaps, in the very long term, will we be able to just step back and see this as one of the stranger episodes in national history and political culture, even national character. So I think to work out, the fundamental paradox, which is the Western country, leaving aside New Zealand, which has almost the smallest asylum seeker problem, has had almost the largest asylum seeker politics. And that really requires quite a lot of thought, I think.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.